You all remember that Plato says a dog is the most philosophical of animals. So I'm raising the intellectual level of the class by bringing my best student here, or maybe my best teacher. And I have to tell you, I sometimes mention animals in my writings about the mind and language and stuff like that. And people actually know about animals get furious. A guy wrote me a letter and he said, look, why is it that philosophers, instead of looking at the serious professional literature on animal cognition research, always talk about their damned household pets? And I had to agree. I do talk about my household pets, and I know there is this vast literature on animal research. But the truth is, Gilbert and I have been discussing these matters for years, and I would trust him much more. I mean, his rival, I grant you, is pretty good. It's a French guy. I mentioned him before in class, Vauclair. And he's pretty good. He wrote the standard book on animal cognition. But given a choice between Gilbert and Vauclair, I mean, it's pretty clear where I'm going to go. Now you see why. Okay, well, where are we? We're damn near the end of the term. And what do you want to do next week? I mean, I have as I always tell you, experience is the worst teacher. And I have 50 years of experience where what you do in the last week is you go over the old material, but you don't introduce new material. But nowadays there's a move afoot where you don't do anything. You don't even come to class. And there seems to be a general enthusiasm for that. I don't know. But anyway, next Thursday, I will try to hand out sample exam questions so you have something to think about. And then maybe the last week, you could come and I could discuss how those questions might be answered. I'll give you a whole lot of questions on the sample sheet. But anyway, think about what you'd like to do because we have only 2 more weeks. And in principle, at least, I'm not supposed to introduce new intellectual content after Thursday, though God knows how I'm supposed to abide by that because I don't remember what I taught you in the other 16 weeks since I don't have proper notes. Come to think of it, I don't have any notes. Oh, well. Anyway, here we go. Now, last time we were talking about human rights. And as I told you, there are 2 views about human rights. One is, it's just obvious we all have these rights. What's the problem? No big deal. As Bernard Williams says, the problem with human rights is not to figure out what they are or where they came from, but to try to get them enforced. And then there's another school of thought led by Jeremy Bentham and that other guy, Alice, what's his name? I can't remember his names anymore. Alistair McIntyre, who says it's a whole lot of nonsense. It's just ridiculous to think there are such things as human rights. I think that we're not going to. I think that there is a genuine problem about human rights, but we now, as a result of the material we've been discussing in this course, have the resources to answer that. The existence of human rights is a status function like any other. Logically speaking, it's no more mysterious that we assign rights to human beings than that we assign value to bits of paper in the form of money. It's not a mystery. The only puzzling thing is that normally rights are thought to arise out of position within an institutional structure. You own property. You're a citizen of the United States. You have a California driver's license. You're over the age of 21. All of these give you rights because of your position in an institutional structure. So what's puzzling about human rights is you don't have to have an institutional structure. Just being human is the Y term. I guess it's also the X term. You satisfy a certain biological condition. You got the right number of chromosomes. That's the X term. And that counts as being human for the purpose of rights. And therefore, you are the bearer of rights. Can we justify that, though? I mean, it's not absolutely arbitrary. There must be some justification why we list some things as human rights and why we assign them to humans and not, say, to rats. And I said that there are 2 features that underlie the justification of human rights. One is a conception of human nature, what we think is essential to a flourishing life as a human being. And secondly, related to that, an axiology, a set of values. So I think it's natural for human beings to talk. We are speech act performing animals, and consequently we have a ground for saying, well, there's a right to talk. There's a right to freedom of speech to express your ideas. The only thing is, you don't want to say that everything that's part of human nature you have a right to do, because there are lots of things that are part of human nature. I think violence is natural to our species, particularly among males. Young males obviously derive DNA satisfaction in beating up on other young males. We found ways to channel that in the form of football and stuff like that. But basically, it seems to be a kind of natural expression, but I don't think there's a right to beat up other people. Why is there a right to free speech and no right for males to beat up other males? Well, it's a long story, but the basic point is that we value free speech in a way that we don't value violence. Violence as such is not something regarded as desirable. Now, this gives me two burdens in my theory of human rights. One is I have to have a theory of human nature, and two, I have to have a theory of what's valuable in human nature. I think I can justify both of those. Talk of human nature has become unfashionable in recent decades because it has such a sordid history. But if we forget about the 18th century conception of human nature and just think about what we actually know from biology, then it seems to me perfectly legitimate to talk about human rights. Now, lately, people have been getting the idea, well, why are we so speciesist? I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's the version of sexist or racist. We're speciesist. What's this thing we got about Homo sapiens, as we modestly call ourselves? How about animal rights? And I think, yeah, you can make a case for animal rights. I try not to think about animal rights because I fear if I did, I'd have to become a vegetarian. And in the end, it will probably happen. But as what's his name said, as Saint Augustine said, give me chastity, but not yet. Give me vegetarianism, but not yet. I'm working on it. Okay, so Gilbert, I'm not going to eat you. There's no danger on that score. All right, so where are we? But there are other things. You see, a lot of people think that various things are culturally conditioned. I think they widely hold that the fact that males don't rape females routinely is a matter of various cultural constraints and laws and stuff like that, laws against rape. But I think that may also be in the DNA. Here's an odd fact. Rape among primates is very rare. The males are bigger and tougher than the females, but I talked to primate guys about this. They're a bit embarrassed by my apparently obsessive interest in this question. But apparently the guys who understand about primate life tell me that among primates is very rare. It's not at all common. And I think that's probably true among humans. That rape is probably as much an expression of power as it is an expression of sexual desire. Here's a mystery. Why don't American armies rape? And British army, generally Protestant armies don't rape much. The Russians raped their way across Europe. In Berlin alone, there were 100,000 illegitimate babies 9 months after the Russian invasion of Berlin. Now, I want to say, it seems to me there's probably more than sex involved. Those were expressions of power and violence and revenge and a whole lot of other factors that mostly connect with the whole issue of pride and shame. Okay, anyway, back to human rights. I think there's no intellectual puzzle about human rights. Now, Americans make two mistakes that are very common. One is they think all rights must be given to us by God. Well, the problem with that is if our rights come from God, then God keeps changing his mind. There was a time when only white males had human rights. These rights were gradually extended to other parts of the population, though it took a long time before females and people of other racial extraction acquired full human rights. So I think it is not useful in these discussions to suppose our rights come from God. Another thing I told you about last time, and that is there's a wonderful procedure in the United States whereby you can cut off the discussion of rights simply by citing the constitutional provision in question. But of course that's absurd. We want to be able to say yes, and why should there be this provision in the Constitution? Okay, now the main thing I said last time that I think is controversial, that is assuming you grant me that it's legitimate to talk about rights at all, the main thing I said is that you need a distinction between positive rights and negative rights. And if you look at the classical 18th century theories, the Enlightenment theories of human rights, on which the United States Constitution is based, where very much the United States is an invention of the European Enlightenment. If you look at those rights, if you look at the Bill of Rights, they are, as far as I know, without exception, negative rights. They're rights to be left alone. Strictly speaking, your right to free speech is a right you have against Congress. Congress shall pass no law restricting the freedom of speech. But lately, and particularly in the 20th century, there arose the idea, well, that in addition to negative rights, there are positive rights. There are rights that everybody has to adequate housing, adequate education, adequate pensions in old age, and so on. I think I cannot give a justification for positive rights. Now, I'm repeating a point I made last time, and that is you have to distinguish between the negative version of the positive right, that is to say, everybody has a right to seek adequate housing and to seek higher education. But those are negative rights. That means you have a right to be left alone to try to get an adequate housing and higher education. But it doesn't, that has to be distinguished from saying, no, everybody has a positive right to adequate housing, because, as I pointed out, the notion of rights only makes sense if a right is a right against somebody, and that means the right that the somebody is against has that person has an obligation. That if you have a right against somebody, then that person has an obligation to enable you to exercise your right. And in this case, it would place all of us under an obligation to provide adequate housing, nationality, pensions in old age, and all that sort of thing for everybody in the world. And I cannot justify that. I can't make sense of that. I'll take a question in a minute, because this is a crucial point. Now, if you look at the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, it seems to me it's an extremely sloppy document, and I'm amazed that they got away with it. And I meant to bring a copy today, and I got, well, Gilbert and I were in another discussion. Anyway, I'll try and remember to bring one on Thursday, or you can Google, you can find it. It's very easy. And I think it's a scandal, because I don't think they had any justification. I don't think they thought it through in a way that I'm trying to think it through here as to what would be a list of universal positive human rights. Now, various people have pointed out to me, well, really, you have to think of that as a kind of a legal document. What they're trying to say is that if you sign the United Nations Charter, if you join the United Nations, then you're committing yourself to recognizing these as rights. But I don't think that's any help. Maybe we can think of it legally, but the whole idea was it isn't that they arbitrarily selected some list, as they arbitrarily selected San Francisco to be the place where this document was drawn up, but rather they think independently of your signing the United Nations Charter, there is some existing universal human right that you are endorsing, and that's what I'm challenging, the idea that there is an existing universal human right independently of any legal sanction that might be imposed. Now, the whole idea of human rights, I think, is an Enlightenment idea. The woman at UCLA named, I forget her first name, but Hunt is her last name, wrote a good book called The Invention of Human Rights. And I read the book and wrote her a letter and said, yeah, well, you don't tell us who invented them. Who was the person who invented human rights? And she said, well, there isn't any single person. There was nobody who did it. It just grew up as an Enlightenment conception. Now, various people have pointed out to me, Marga Vega points out that, well, the conquistadores had a conception of human rights in the New World because they thought that God had given the natives certain rights. And somebody else who knows the Greek philosophy says, well, the Stoics had a kind of conception of human rights as well. I am suspicious of both of these. I think, yes, I can see that there's something like human rights in the Bible and something like human rights in Stoic philosophy, but those are quite different from our Enlightenment conception, where it's not your relation to God that gives you human rights, but rather it's your status as a human being. These are not just God's gift to you, but rather things you are entitled to as a human being. So the whole flavor of the discussion of human rights changes in the 19th century. You see, you could say, well, it follows from the Bible that everybody has a right to life because it says thou shalt not kill, and that everybody has a right to be honored if they're fathers and mothers because it says honor thy father and mother. The whole flavor of the Ten Commandments is totally different from the Declaration of Human Rights, of universal human rights, of the rights of man, as they were called in the French Revolution. So I think our conception of human rights is very much an Enlightenment conception. It is a product of a certain conception of human nature and of the role of government in human life. Okay, now the next topic, I want to finish off this part of the discussion, and then I'm going to go on and talk about various confusions that you find in intellectual life about human rights, and I think there are massive confusions in this discussion. I'm going to sort them out. You had a question? Yeah. What, every person what?
If you had like some sort of socialist or communist,
yeah,
it might make sense to say that everyone has a right to adequate housing.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. No, but let me make another distinction, and that is if a particular state wants to say, for example, the state of California will provide adequate housing for all of our citizens, then that seems to me legitimate. They're not saying this is a universal human right. They're saying as a matter of public policy, we're going to give everybody a right to do this. So the state of California in its deep wisdom has said, if you're over the age of 21, you have a right to drink alcohol. If you're under the age of 21, you have no such right. Now that's a matter of public policy. But I'm not talking about that. Now I'm talking about a moral question, universal human rights. Now later on today I want to get to why communism and socialism failed. But I agree with what you said. Of course, that somebody might say, relative to a certain society, everybody should have such and such a right. In fact, when I came to this state, one of the reasons I came here was because they had the idea, none of you are old enough to remember this, that everybody in the state of California who is intellectually qualified has a right to a free university education. Think about that. And that was one of the things I found attractive. I don't think it's a universal human right. It's a right to California citizens, or rather it used to be a right to California citizens. Okay, but anyway, I appreciate that question. Yes, Arden. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
A right that and it's a right to protection.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's a... Okay, this is a very deep point about the background, so let me emphasize it. If you look at the actual text of the Bill of Rights, it's rather narrow. It says Congress shall pass no law. Like all Americans, I think I know the Constitution by heart, though I haven't actually looked at it for 30 years. But I think also when it comes to things like the freedom of religion, it says there shall be no established church. Congress shall pass no law respecting the establishment of religion. Now, the way that we have interpreted that, and this is the background in operation, is we have interpreted that as a universal human right. So nobody can say, well, it just says Congress can't restrict the right of free speech, but how about the California state legislature? It doesn't mention them in the First Amendment to the Constitution. Well, we've interpreted that so that it now applies generally. By the way, it's a sort of nonsense to think that every conceivable thing is written in the Constitution. The Constitution says nothing about the creation of an Air Force. It enables the creation of an Army and a Navy, but guess what? In the 18th century, they weren't thinking about an Air Force, but it's a perfectly natural assumption of the armed of the right that the government has to create military forces, to think that the Air Force is a natural extension of that. And similarly, with the right of the Supreme Court to have judicial review. That's nowhere stated in the Constitution. These are just background practices that have grown up, and they're absolutely accepted. Americans, even lawyers, accept the right of judicial review, but there's nothing in the Constitution that guarantees it. It was established by Marshall in, what was the name of the case? McCullough and Maryland. Yes. All right. Well, he passed. You're next, and then at the back of the room. You're on. Yeah. Okay, well, here's another thing, and that is, under certain conditions, and we hope those conditions can be precisely specified, you can lose your rights. So, for example, if you are a convicted felon, you lose that sacred right to keep and bear arms, and you lose all kinds of rights to free speech while you're in jail. So we think that, and I agree, that there are certain conditions in which you can override people's rights. Now, I want to talk today about that very issue because that's a source of much confusion. People think, well, if you can override the right, then you didn't really have a right in the first place. Or maybe it wasn't an honest-to-John unconditional right, but it was only a conditional prima facie right. And worse yet, they think if you can override something on utilitarian grounds, then it follows that it was a utilitarian right in the first place. Okay, back of the room, you had your hand up. Yeah, you have to talk loud because I'm practically deaf.
I wanted to ask you that everyone has a right to seek housing or a job. It's just like it's an expression of actually negative rights that they're...
That's right. Yeah, what I'm saying is, if you give the negative version of the positive rights, it seems to me legitimate. If you say, look, everybody has a right to try to get adequate housing for themselves and their families, that seems legitimate. But it's quite different to say everyone has a right to adequate housing, because rights imply obligations. A right is always an obligation of somebody else, and that says everybody has an obligation to provide adequate housing for everybody else, and that I cannot justify. Say some more. Yeah, you'd have to remind me what Martha Nussbaum says about it. I don't remember.
In terms of saying that people have a right to a capacity to develop these things, which seems to be a positive right.
That sounds to me like a negative right. It just means negative rights in general are rights to be left alone to do what you want to do. If you have a capacity, then you have a right to develop that capacity. That's a pure negative right. See, I think the aim of higher education is to bring everybody to the highest possible level that they're capable of attaining. But what that means is that we provide facilities that enable them to try to attain this level. I don't beat up my students to make sure they're doing as well in calculus as they should, because the right that they have to develop their intellect is a negative right. Yeah, say some more. You're obviously worried about this. That's a negative right. And the crucial question is, what do you have to do? And in the case of free speech, you don't have to do anything. You just leave people alone. But in the case of a universal right to adequate housing, if everybody in the Amazon basin has a right against all of us to adequate housing, then we have to pony up money to build houses in the Amazon basin. That's the distinction. What do you have to do to implement the right? Now, I don't want to spend the whole damn day on this, but people are interested in this. So at the back of the room, yeah.
If there are universal human rights, then why aren't there universal human obligations?
There are. Yes, absolutely. Let me. I didn't write it on the blackboard because I was too damn lazy. But if you look at the very end of your book, I actually did it in the predicate calculus. Why? Not because I think there's any deep metaphysical insight in the predicate calculus, but because I live in an era where many of my colleagues think if you can't state it in the predicate calculus, you can't state it. I mean, it couldn't possibly be true. So I put in quantificational logic a statement of the relation of rights and obligations. And to put it in ordinary English, if there is a universal negative right, then it follows that every human being is under an obligation to respect that right. Now, the problem with positive rights is if there is a universal positive right, then it follows logically that every human being in the world is under a positive obligation to take steps to implement that right, and I can't make that out. I can't make a case for that. As a result of being talked to by people like yourselves in an earlier year, my students did convince me, well, there is at least one positive right, and that is the right to life and survival if you're immediately threatened and you're helpless and the person is in a position to help you. So I think if the guy is run over by a truck and he's lying there bleeding to death in the gutter, yes, I am under an obligation to help him out, and so is everybody else. Now, if he's in Vladivostok bleeding, I'm not under an obligation to help him. So you have to restrict this, but that seems to me the one exception I can think of is where life and survival are threatened in the immediate situation. The person in question is unable to help themselves because they're helpless, a case of small infants, for example. Then it seems to me there is a universal positive right. That's the only one I can think of, and I'm embarrassed by that because it makes me uncomfortable. Who hasn't spoken? You haven't spoken.
Yeah, I'm still confused as to how you say universal human rights exist when nobody's recognizing them.
Yeah, okay. Now here is, I said this last time, that there look like two things that are inconsistent, but they're not necessarily inconsistent. They're just different ways of saying the same thing. One is to say, people have always had the right to free speech. It just wasn't recognized until the 18th century. Another way to say is the right to free speech didn't exist until the 18th century, at which point it came into existence. Now, formally speaking, those have to be inconsistent. Logically speaking, they can't both be true because one's a negation implies a negation of the other. But if you interpret them in terms of the apparatus that I gave you about X and Y status functions, there's a way of interpreting them where they can both be true. The one that says rights have always existed says people always satisfied the X term and X counts as Y, so they were human beings, and therefore they had the rights even if they were not recognized. The other side says rights only exist if they're recognized. So you all know, you've all read enough of my work to know how I'm going to describe this, and the answer is you can say either that the Y status function exists but wasn't recognized, or you can say institutional facts exist only insofar as they're recognized, and if the Y status function isn't recognized, it doesn't exist. Now, this is of some practical importance, because some people are going to say, well, look, Al Gore was actually elected. Am I getting the right election? Let's put the other guy in. George W. Bush was not elected in the year 2000, but they did, in fact, count him. The Supreme Court, in its wisdom, counted him as the president-elect, and that was recognized even though he didn't have a right to the election. Or you can say, no, it's institutional facts are what's recognized, and his election as president was recognized. That's it. End of story. Yes, you're next, and then you, and then we're going to go on. Then I'm actually going to make some progress today. Yes. No. Yeah. It's true in general of status functions. It's true in general of status functions. I am the actual inheritor of the fortune, but unfortunately the courts held against me. Or you can say, well, I didn't inherit the fortune because they didn't count me as the inheritor, and those can both report the same facts. Given the X counts as Y and C formula, you can see two different ways of reporting the same facts. Now, that doesn't mean that they're both innocent. On the contrary, wars are fought over them. This really our territory. You just happen to have occupied it for the past 300 years. Or you could say, well, it's not really our territory because it hadn't been recognized for 300 years. So these are non-trivial, these issues, but there are ways of interpreting these where they're not necessarily inconsistent. One more try. Yeah.
You say that one of them, you can say, oh, well, they were always the X terms, so they just weren't recognized as collections. But the statement of human counts as right there in context of Earth.
Yeah, on Earth, yeah. Or everywhere.
That statement is a statement of rights. So to say that they always fulfill the X term is to say that there always was an X term.
Yeah. Yes.
So,
They've always been humans. No, it didn't. But now, do you mean that if I say, look, the human beings have always had a right to free speech. It's only recently that this has been recognized. That I must be saying something false? I don't think so. I think there's a way of interpreting that where it just says the conditions under which I recognize your right to free speech are conditions that have been met throughout history. They weren't always recognized. Yeah. Right.
Is what I would say, but that's a very different statement than you've always been entitled to.
Yes. Yeah. But now you think that it's not true to say you've always been entitled to free speech?
Yeah, I think that's not true.
You think it's not true? Well, okay, I want to give you a special case of that. It was only recently that women have been recognized as equal bearers of rights, and you want to say, well, actually, women were not entitled to any rights until quite recently. They couldn't own property, vote in elections, and so on. I think they were always entitled to these rights. Admittedly, I've probably been brainwashed by feminists, but I think I can make a good case for that. Yes, you're still on.
They may have been always entitled to the rights.
Yeah. Well, okay. But now, the first formula I put was entitled, and you said no, they weren't entitled. People weren't entitled to these rights recently. Exactly. And it is to ought we're doing in both cases. I want to say there's no substance to this dispute. And the reason is that we're talking about two alternative descriptions of the same set of facts. And the formula X counts as Y will always provide you with these alternative descriptions precisely because something can satisfy the X term and therefore qualify the Y term and it's not recognized. So you can say, well, all the same, they had the Y status function even if it wasn't recognized. Or you can say they didn't really have it because you don't have it if it isn't recognized. I don't see any substance to the dispute. I have here a comment from France. She's just back from Paris. Yeah.
Be there without having been recognized. So
yeah.
People had the need to stop smoking before.
Yeah, it is analogous to that. Yeah. And I want to say people needed vitamin C before anybody knew about it. Yeah, of course. But again, I don't think, as I said, and I'm repeating myself, I don't think there's any substance to the issue, provided you see all the facts in question. Okay, any other questions at this point? Because let's go on now. Well, we got a whole lot of other issues I wanted to talk about. At some point, I thought we should talk about why socialism failed. So let's do that. What? Okay, let's do it. Yeah. Go ahead. I probably won't answer it because I've already started thinking about socialism.
There seems to be this preference for human rights.
Yeah.
Always assume that the larger institutions' rights supersede the smaller institutions' rights. Why are we doing that?
The larger institutions' rights supersede the small. Oh, I see, because humanity is a bigger institution. Yeah. Oh, well, no, I think the answer is very clear. The whole notion that we've been having, and that indeed the whole discussion throughout this semester, has very important implications for morality. Morality, as Kant was aware, is about desire-independent reasons for action. And what I've been talking about is how human beings can create and become bound by desire-independent reasons for action. Now, what we say when there are universal human rights is we're saying there are moral constraints of a universal type that are binding on us regardless of the institutional structures that we find ourselves in. Even if you find yourself in a situation that has slavery, all the same, there are moral constraints against slavery because everybody has a right not to be a slave. See, slavery is an interesting case from my point of view because on my analysis, if you take literally slavery as it existed in the southern states of the United States, the slave had zero rights because the slave was not a human being. The slave was treated as a piece of property. This is why when the Southerners captured slaves, former slaves who had been fighting for the North, were fighting for the Union armies, they didn't treat them as prisoners of war. They were not human beings. They just shot them on the spot. Now, here's an interesting question, and that is, why didn't the people that we most admire among the ancient Greeks like Plato and Aristotle think there was anything wrong with slavery? They didn't. Aristotle thought it's very important that the right people should not be slaves, but he didn't see anything wrong with the institution as such. He thought of it basically the way we think of prisoners, of convicted criminals. We see nothing wrong with prisons as such. It just we want to be sure the right people are in prison. But the idea that some people ought to be in prison, that doesn't strike us as morally outrageous, and similarly with slavery. Now here's an interesting question. The Greeks and the Romans, these advanced civilizations, they had slavery. But the Germans running around the forests, a bunch of Nibelungs running around there waiting for Wagner to give them a song, they did not have slavery. Now, why not? Were they nicer than the Greeks and the Romans? Well, I hate it when professors ask you a question where they already know the answer, so I'm going to tell you the answer. They couldn't afford it. Hunter-gatherer societies cannot afford slavery because they don't. Slavery requires surplus. It requires an economic surplus that some people can live off the labor of other people. So the Greeks and the Romans had slavery in a way that the northern tribes in the forest did not have slavery, simply because the Greeks and the Romans could afford to have it. But it's very interesting how long slavery existed in literate societies before it was nowadays more or less universally condemned. Even societies that have slavery today are kind of embarrassed about it. They don't advertise it much. Whereas in the ancient times, people took it for granted. It just was a normal part of a human social ontology. All right, I swore we're going to get off of this subject, but here I got another question. Yeah.
Do you think you could say something more about why you don't think, or why you can't justify more positive human rights?
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, no, this is a good question. Why can't I justify positive human rights? And the answer is effectively utilitarian. It places too great a demand. It's reasonable to say that everybody ought to let everybody else alone to exercise their free speech. It is not reasonable to say everybody is in the world is under an obligation, a binding moral obligation to provide adequate housing for everybody in the world. There are just too many people running around in the world. Yes.
So isn't that just to say that there is no way for us to be able to do that?
Yes. Okay. Now the temptation is to think, well, really, when we say people have rights, what we're really saying is, wouldn't it be nice if? And wouldn't it be nice if everybody had adequate housing? And what's wrong with that? It would be nice, but I want to say if we take rights seriously, there's more to claiming a human right than just saying it would be awfully nice if people behave this way. We want to say, no, there's a binding obligation on people to behave this way, and that's why I can't make sense out of the notion of positive rights except for very tiny, limited class. Say one last thing.
So like right now, it's been shown, at least in some sort of like economical development studies, that if everyone in the U.S. donated 10% of our income to, I guess, like the developing countries with
Yeah.
a lot of like starving children, then you could get rid of everyone, all the like little kids who are out in malnourished.
Yeah, you could overcome childhood malnutrition.
Right. So
Yeah.
basically, it's in sort of way that you would, everyone has a right to food in that
Yeah.
sort of sense because it's feasible.
Yeah.
And I don't see why you couldn't grant that as a sort of universal
Yeah, I don't think it's a universal human right. I don't know if everybody at the back could hear, but it's a good case. It's always one of these stories I'm always suspicious of is if only we would give 10% of our income to whatever it is, curing AIDS or overcoming progressive athlete's foot or whatever it is, we would just change life for everybody. It would be much better for everybody. And maybe it's a good matter of public policy, and that seems to me a reasonable question for the United States to adopt as a question of public policy. Should we do this? But it seems to me that's a different issue from the question, is there an absolutely exceptionalist universal human right to have food, no matter what situation you're located in, and so on. And I don't think so. I don't think I am now under an obligation to provide food for everybody in the world. However, I'm repeating myself. I want to go on to socialism. So here goes. Okay, now I'm not sure it's even worth talking about this because I think socialism has largely become dead in your generation. But there was a time when intellectuals like yourselves were very attracted to the socialist ideal, and it looked like on straightforward empirical grounds. It just looked like if you treat economics as an empirical discipline and you put socialism on this side and capitalism on this side and you list the distinctive features, well, it looks like you can make, I mean, now it's very important to say you mustn't get excited ideologically. You got to think of this. It's an empirical question. Which is the system that delivers the economic goods better? Well, socialism provides you with something like equality of condition, whereas capitalism looks like definitely it provides you with inequality. And whatever else that seems to be, it seems to have a connection with what's just and what's unjust, because it looks like inequalities ought to be justified and the inequalities of capitalism seem to be unjustified. In the case of socialism also, you have a stable economic condition. You don't have these wild fluctuations where people are thrown out of work without any reasonable, without any good social grounds for being thrown out of work. They're just out of work. Look around you. There are lots of people that are out of work now, whereas capitalism is unstable. And related to that, you get in socialism full employment, and in capitalism mass unemployment. And then what seemed to a lot of people to be the decisive consideration, in the case of socialism, you get decisions made by trained intelligence. People can actually plan what to do. They can plan a reasonable distribution of resources. Capitalism, well, it's hard to describe it, but it's more like random chaos. I mean, at the time when socialism was very popular among intellectuals in the United States, that was an era when the car companies positively competed with each other for meaningless expenditures that they could put on their cars. Tail fins were everybody's favorite. This was in the 1950s because a lot of money was spent on extra steel that performed no function whatever. I mean, you could argue that if they could get up to the speed of sounds, the tail fins would add to stability, but at highway speeds they made no difference to anything. So in the case of socialism, you get equality, stability, full employment, and trained intelligence making the decision. Whereas in the case of capitalism, you get inequality, instability, mass unemployment, and random chaos as far as the decisions were concerned. And indeed, where socialism was concerned, it looked like you got something like rational progress. So, for example, a government might decide, let us devote a certain amount of our resources to solving certain types of technological problems, whereas here the kind of progress you got was irrational. You got irrational change, which may or may not be progressive. It may or may not lead to progress. Well, if you were a young intellectual of, let's say, 60 years ago, not very long, it looks pretty clear who's winning this argument. And again, forget about ideology. Forget all about Karl Marx and Stalin and all those bad guys. Just think about what is a rational way to organize society on an empirical basis. Suppose you adopted the assumption, as a lot of people did, look, in general, we want a utilitarian basis for economic organization. We want an economic organization that produces the goods, which one produces the goods better than the other. And it looks like you got, not only does this one produce the goods, socialism as opposed to capitalism, but it looks like it's a straightforward factual question. And indeed, one of the decisive arguments was, in this one, you're going to get inevitable growth because it's planned, and here you have cycles. You have ups and downs, and we're now in one of the down cycles. Okay, so I think you can make a pretty good case for socialism. Now we're going to forget about ideology. We're going to forget about Karl Marx and Lenin and the renegade Kautsky and the whole history of the Second International and tragedy that overcame Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. There may be people in this room for whom those names mean nothing. You have not wept over the murder, the assassination of Rosa Luxemburg. Well, okay, but I'm leaving her out of this equation now. We're just talking about an empirical issue. Which social organization is better likely to deliver the goods? Yes. Oh, you think so? Yeah. Okay, well, you give me, yeah. Yeah, okay. All right, well, let's put it. Incentive. And what was the other word you used? What was the other thing? You get incentives over here, and instead of random chaos, you get market forces. Okay? Market forces, because I have to tell you, a high percentage of the intellectuals of an earlier generation thought that's another name for random chaos. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. So you're going to get planned obsolescence. There needn't be conscious planning, but the market forces themselves will result in obsolescence. So what could be more obsolete? I have a cell phone that I think I bought just yesterday, and I'm assured by my experts in the office it's way out of date. It's possibly a Stone Age cell phone. It hasn't even got an iPod or a tripod or whatever it's supposed to have that makes it actually up to date. Now I have to tell you some other features of this. There was a guy who attacked this, whom I later sort of got to know, and he seemed quite smart to me. His name was Friedrich Hayek, and when I was an undergraduate, I wondered if I should read his book because it came out when I was an undergraduate. It's called The Road to Serfdom. And basically what it says is, if you get in bed with these guys over here, you're straight on the road to the gulag. You're going to wind up in concentration camps, not in a nice place like Dnipropetrovsk, but in northern Siberia. And now Hayek, I think, is one of the smartest guys I ever met. But actually, I never met him. I corresponded with him. But he was regarded as slightly a comical figure. I mean, I remember a professor telling us, a professor of economics telling us, well, he's the last of the Mohicans of the classical economists. And also, I'll tell you, other economists, quite brilliant, famous economists, who told us, look, in the long run, this side is bound to succeed, because it's got trained intelligence on its side. And if you like this side, well, it's okay. It's true, you do get more freedom on this side, but you pay a price. The price is progressive impoverishment. But let's get it over here. Let's put it down. On this side, you got greater freedom. And over on this side, you got planning, complete planning of the whole economy. Okay, so I'm going to come back to your point. I mean, here's the interesting question. What I'm trying to do is pose this question. If you write it out like that, it looks like which side, it looks pretty good. Which side is gives you the better result? And it's true that you might say, well, all the same, the stuff that's below the line here is more precious than anything above. This is, in the end, a position that I came to. But it looked to me like you had to pay a tremendous price. And the price was you were going to be backward. You were not going to keep up. And indeed, this is true of Oxford. When I was an undergraduate, thought it had great economists, and many of them got Nobel Prizes, and they were regarded as very smart. And a very smart economist taught us in class that essentially there was no way the capitalist economies could compete with the socialist economies effectively for these kinds of reasons. They just didn't have trained intelligence. They're busy wasting themselves in these ridiculous business cycles and with unemployment where the socialist economies were bound to succeed. As Khrushchev famously said, we will bury you. And he didn't mean that we're going to dig a grave and put you in it. We're going to bury you with our great prosperity. Now there was a difficulty, and that is anybody who bothered to visit the countries of the socialist camp, anybody who went to the Soviet Union or indeed any part of the Soviet enterprise, the Soviet Empire, was struck by the incredible backwardness and poverty. It isn't just that they didn't have cars with tail fins, they didn't have cars. And the few cars that they did produce were absolutely dreadful. And that wasn't so bad, but you couldn't even buy toothpaste or toilet paper. If there was a line of people in the street, it was because toothpaste had suddenly become available and everybody was lined up for it. When I was an undergraduate, a delegation of Soviet students came to Oxford to visit us. And the first question they asked me, I had a typical Oxford undergraduate's accommodation of 2 rooms. The first question they asked me was, do you live here with your family? The idea that a single person might occupy a living room and a bedroom, that was just inconceivable to them. And they did say, well, the stores seem to be well stocked. They walked down the high street and saw all these goods in the stores. But it was clear that nobody could afford anything because there were no queues. There were no lines of people outside the stores as there would be in the Soviet Union. Okay, so now we're already beginning to find certain kinds of nervousness about this distinction as it was described. And one of the early guys to point out the threats involved. Now, I think Hayek overstates the case. Essentially, Hayek thinks, incidentally, that's why he is so much admired by the well, what shall I call them? The Tea Party is what they call themselves, by people who occupy I think a somewhat eccentric position in American political life, admire Hayek because basically what he said is, if you accept the principles of the welfare state, it's bound to lead to oppression. It is bound to lead. That's why the book is called The Road to Serfdom. Now, I had a funny history with Hayek. As an undergraduate, I was taught, don't bother to read this guy. He's completely out of date, a total a Neanderthal. Eventually, I did read it and thought it was pretty good. And I was asked by a famous newspaper to cite the best book of the 20th century. And I had to write an article on the best book of the 20th century. And I said, well, it's easy. I'll do Joyce's Ulysses. And they said, no, that's already taken. You can't have that one. Oh, I couldn't have Joyce's Ulysses. Okay, I'll do Proust's À la Recherche. No, that's already taken. You can't have Proust. So in desperation, I said, okay, I'll do Hayek. And I wrote an article about why Hayek was the best book. Hayek's Road to Serfdom was the best book of the 20th century. This is the curse of journalism. You don't actually get a chance to say what you really want to say, but you have to say a modified version of it. But in any case, I like the book, and I like his courage for producing it. He was also a philosopher, and I wrote an interesting book about perception and stuff like that. When I was giving a bunch of lectures on the BBC, he wrote to me, and we had a correspondence. Anyway, we're now going to talk about some of the difficulties with this picture. Okay, other question. I saw hands up. Yes.
What kind of society you are?
Okay, now Candida asked me, what kind of socialism are we talking about? And of course, I have been tacitly making a distinction, which I now need to make fully explicit. You have to distinguish between Marxism, Leninism, which I've not been talking about so far except incidentally, and democratic socialism. Now, the socialism that we aspired to was not Marxism, Leninism, but it was more like what can we call social democracy. It was democratic socialism. However, I have to tell you that though it seems obvious what the distinction is today, it got blurred in practice. The leading Marxist theorist of the time, G.D.H. Cole, used to conduct Wednesday evening seminars for undergraduates. It was sort of heroic because he gave us every Wednesday evening, and all of us undergraduates showed up. But the guy who was most admired there was an obvious, total, committed communist fanatic. Now, it's true, I thought the guy was a total nut, but he was a complete Soviet apologist. And we talk about the difficulties of socialism, and he would say, there's one country in which these problems do not arise. And he meant the Soviet Union. We were talking about poverty and injustice, and it was always, in the Soviet Union, everything is simply wonderful. He was a total, partaychik is the word. He was a total Communist Party hack. I don't know what became of him. I'm sure he was a smart guy, so he would have come to something. His name was pronounced, English have problems with pronunciation. They pronounce it Rafe Samuel was his name. But it was actually spelled Ralph Samuel, and for all I know, he may have been Samuels. But anyway, he was a total fanatic, and it was clear that he was the most prestigious figure in this socialist discussion group that we had. Another thing that struck me about it was its religious air. It was never, what's the best way for Britain to organize itself, but it's always, what is a socialist way? And we talked about education, and the idea was not what's the education that will produce the highest intellectual level, but what is a socialist education. Socialism had a kind of religious flavor to it, because it was always, this is what we're aiming for is socialism, in the same way that if you were a member of, I also went to the Baptist Bible School in Chugwater, Wyoming, and in Chugwater, though we were more cynical in Chugwater, it being a more sophisticated society than the Oxford of my generation, the question in Baptist Bible School is, what is a Christian way of life, and what is a Christian way of organizing relationship? In the same sense, people worried about what is a truly socialist form of government. Okay, I want to say it seems fairly clear to me that both kinds of socialism, both the Marxist kind and the democratic kind, failed. The Marxist kind failed in a way that's more spectacular, and it's fairly easy to explain the reasons for its failure, and I'll do that rather briefly. But to me, the interesting thing is, why did this one fail so spectacularly? It's getting a kind of prestige again, precisely because capitalism's in a mess. We're in one of the periodic economic downturns that my economist friends assured me would never happen again, because we now understand economics too well, but it is happening again. So socialism will get a kind of prestige again. See, here was a problem in the FSM. You're now all experts on the FSM. What vision of society did the FSM have? The answer is they didn't have one. Mario thought of himself as a socialist. He would tell you that he was a democratic socialist, but it was a kind of fatuous, undergraduate, ill-thought-out socialism. But the FSM, though it thought of itself as a revolutionary movement, it had no vision of society, whereas this particular debate, this particular phase of human history, socialism offered us a vision of society, and many people found it in varying degrees attractive. I was always annoyed by the tiresome religious no fun element that it had, but still it seemed to me it's a factual question, and it looked to me like factually the guys on the left hand side had the better of it. Now there are other factors involved. Again, when I was an undergraduate in Oxford, there were two sets of clubs. There were the right wing clubs run by the Conservative Party, and there were the left-wing clubs run by the Labour Party and the Socialists. The main argument for the right-wing clubs is that the girls were much better looking, and the food and wine were just a whole lot better. It was just a whole lot better to go to the conservative clubs. I don't even want to think about what it was like at the Labour Party clubs. But in any case, those were totally irrational, or at least non-rational reasons for finding one more congenial than the other. All right, other questions, because I'm now going to tell you why this failed. Okay, let's look ahead for a definition of socialism. What is it that we're talking about when we talk about the failure of socialism? Well, again, I go to my teacher in this, G.D.H. Cole. It's too bad that he's not famous anymore, because during his lifetime he was the most famous socialist theorist. He was the most famous living Marxist theorist, but he believed, or said he believed, in democratic socialism. And he defined it. I've given you this before, so I'll be rather brief. He said there were 4 features. You had to have public ownership and control of the means of production. As long as those were not, as long as the means of production were not controlled by the public, it isn't just that prosperity was impossible, democracy was impossible, because the people who were in charge of the means of production would control the rest of society. Incidentally, as you probably know, I get a lot of visiting scholars from various parts of the world, and one guy from China told me, well, that's exactly what they were taught in school. I mean, when they went to high school, they were given this list. It was in, it was in symbols like that, and I'm famous for being unable to understand Chinese. But in a dialect of Chinese, which you probably don't understand, this means equality, and they had a whole lot of those, a whole lot of precisely these distinctions. But in any case, I'm telling you the definition of socialism. You have public ownership of the means of production. That's the key. And then you have no vast differences in wealth. You might have the guy who works harder might be given more money than the guy who's a lazy bum, but essentially you want equality. You want this particular thing here is essential to the socialist vision, is you have to have equality. Their inequalities would be justified on the principle from each according to his needs, from each according to his abilities, and to each according to his needs. So if there was an inequality in distribution, it would be because some people needed more. And again, there would be no vast class differences. Now, it's hard to explain this one to Americans, but in England in particular, and Europe in general, there were always tremendous differences in social classes. And I've mentioned this before, that in my, again, to this day, but certainly in my, when I grew up as a student in Oxford, you could tell immediately somebody's class by looking at the way they dressed or having 30 seconds of conversation. You knew immediately where they stood in the social class system. And some people welcomed that. Evelyn Waugh has a wonderful passage where he says, marvelous thing about England is that there is a strict class distinction with Buckingham Palace at the top and Wormwood Scrubs Prison at the bottom. And everybody knows exactly where they are in this class system. Now, I have to say, he got it slightly wrong. Duchesses always tended to look down on the queen. They thought, my dear, those shoes. Where does she get those shoes? They thought it was absolutely... so the duchesses thought they were superior to the queen. She didn't even know how to dress. She didn't even go to Paris to get her clothing. But with minor trivial things like that, there was a strict class structure in England. And furthermore, the final feature of the definition was everybody contributes. There is no leisure class of people who don't do any work at all. There are no, in the socialist society, there are to be no parasites. There would be no parasitic class. Okay, well, let's go through why it failed. Everybody's got, now, what I've tried to specify is what exactly are the differences supposed to be between capitalism and socialism. And again, we could come up with more or less on this list, but I think these are the essential ideas. If you want to add something, I'm willing to hear about it, because every time I write this list, I probably give you a different list. But that list I memorized because it was what G.D.H. Cole taught us. I mean, it was his definition of socialism, and these were supposed to be the strengths and weaknesses of each. Now let's talk about Soviet-style socialism, because its failure was spectacular, and it's very interesting to see where it survives. North Korea and Cuba. Well, not exactly the kind of places that you would want to live. North Korea, especially, is appalling. Cuba, in spite of the fact that it was celebrated by intellectual charlatans like Jean-Paul Sartre, is a notch above North Korea, but it's still pretty dreadful. Most of us would be in jail, or I would certainly be in jail, in either of those countries. So why did socialism fail? Well, there are a whole lot of obvious features to the failure, but there's some that are not commonly mentioned, so let me mention them. In the socialist camp, as it was called, that is to say, in countries that were part of the Soviet bloc, part of the Soviet empire, the primary concern of public policy was the maintenance of the regime. The security of the regime was absolutely the #1 priority. Now, it's hard for us to imagine that. George W. Bush did not have to get up in the morning and wonder, is the presidency going to continue? Is the regime going to continue? Will the Constitution go on? Barack Obama may be worried about the Republicans, but he doesn't think, maybe the whole thing is going to collapse. Maybe we're all going to be out of office because the United States as an institution will cease to exist. But in the socialist camp, that was the #1 priority, was the security of the regime became central. Now, that was the #1 consideration. Now, that had consequences that you never see mentioned, but one is this. The people who got power tended to be really second or third-rate people, and they got promoted precisely because they lacked originality and were no threats to anybody. The idea was to be self-effacing. I have some semi-first-hand knowledge of this because my wife had to flee Czechoslovakia when it was taken over by the communists. She was still a teenage girl, and she had to run across a minefield with her father at dusk. She got out of the country. But several interesting things, there were several interesting observations. Of the people in her class, of the girls, it was an all-girls school, of the people in her class, the one who mounted high in the was one of the dumbest in the class, and she got that high in the regime. Everybody knew she was dumb. She didn't have any doubts about her ability. She knew she was dumb. I've met her. But the point is, she got high in the communist hierarchy just by going along. She was not a threat to anybody. She had no original ideas, and there was no threat of original ideas. When I lecture in China, I have a lot of fun, and last time I lectured a group of very good students, and I said, if you think of China as being in competition with the United States, The United States for 50 years had a secret asset that kept the Chinese down. Its name was Mao Zedong. And what he did was keep the Chinese in a state of backwardness, primitiveness, and oppression that prevented the natural abilities of the Chinese people coming out. Here is the absurd thing about traveling around Asia. Everywhere you went, the Chinese were a dominant force in the economy. You go to Manila, you go to Singapore, except Japan, leave out Japan. But if you go to all of these other countries, the Chinese are the dominant force in the economy. They work harder, they're better organized, they're sort of the Jews of Asia. And they're always enthusiastic about working hard and advancing. The one place where they don't succeed is China. China is totally backwards. You know, why don't they bring some Chinese into here, you think, when you go to Shanghai or Beijing? And the answer is, we had a secret weapon, Mao Zedong. I told this to my class in Beijing, and they said, gosh, will you publish that? I've never heard of this idea. And I said, I'd be delighted to publish it. Which of you will translate it? And of course, I did not get enthusiastic eagerness to translate that. I think it's an obvious point, and eventually it will be made, that Mao, with his absurd policies, I mean, the imbecility of the Great Leap Forward, is matched, no, it's exceeded by the Cultural Revolution, one of the most insane pieces of public policy and one of the most vicious in all of human history. 100 million people suffered. I mean, I don't know that the number of people killed exceeded Hitler and Stalin, but the number of people who were abused, imprisoned, tortured, and degraded was certainly stunning. Conservative estimates are 100 million people. To the credit of the Chinese, I have friends in China who tell me, well, I was a Red Guard. They're perfectly willing to admit to that. Whereas when I travel around Germany, nobody ever said, one guy said, I was in the Hitler Youth after the war. One guy, he was drunk at the time. He said, he was in the Hayat, the Hitler Jugend. But if you travel around Germany, you get the idea Hitler must have been a genius because he did it all by himself. No one admitted to giving him any help at all. And this was me hitchhiking around Germany in 1951, whereas a lot of people in China will admit to having been, to their credit, will admit to having been enthusiastic about Mao Zedong. Okay, so one of the sources of failure is that the obsession with security above all leads to the second-rate or third-rate people being in positions of power. Originality, creativity, all of those are systematically discouraged. Now, there's another feature of this, and that is, again, these are structural features that nobody ever bothered to think about. And here's another feature, and that is that the actual population running the countries just got older and older and older. So if a sociologist came from Mars, he would say, well, the chief definition of society is it's run by geriatrics. It's run by people who die in office. One thing about the democratic societies is we kick people out after a few years. Good or bad, you get wiped out of office after a certain number of years. But Mao and Stalin stayed right on to the end. They got older and more decrepit in office. So the country is run by second-rate people. And I think we tend to overestimate Trotsky. If Trotsky were a member of the Berkeley faculty, I don't think we would think very highly of him. But in that crowd, he looked like a real intellectual. In that crowd, he looked like somebody who had ideas and was capable of writing books. In general, then, another feature is that the second-rate people are in charge. The chief obsession is with security, and the upshot is, and this is the crucial point, it didn't deliver the goods economically. And you had a wonderful social experiment where you could observe it. You see, you can't say, what is often said was this. In my childhood, it was often pointed out, well, the reason that communism seems to be failing is that they tried it out in the most backward country in the world. Marx never had the idea that communism was going to take over in the most primitive and backward country, Tsarist Russia, where they had no industrial base to speak of. But that's where it was tried out. And they, among communist apologists, that was the reason for the failure of communism, is it was done in this backward country. But there was a wonderful social experiment, Germany. You could not imagine a more hard-working, disciplined, highly educated people than the Germans. Half of the country was capitalist, half was communist. No question. You could see the failure immediately. You walk through Checkpoint Charlie, and immediately you have a sense of poverty, deprivation, and oppression. It was a physical sense of these things. And West Berlin was a Kurfürstendamm, wonderful vigor, vulgarity, sexuality. I mean, I love the Kurfürstendamm. But all you got to do is go down Unter den Linden, and everything was backward. The universities especially were backward. I'll tell you one story, and then we'll stop. When the countries united, a whole lot of people poured over from East Berlin to get jobs. And I was teaching in West Berlin at the time. And the newspapers were full of stories like the following. A woman got a job in a bakery in West Berlin, and she said to her boss, when are we going to run out of flour? And he said, what are you talking about? This is a bakery. We never run out of flour. We can't function if we're out of flour. And she said, well, in the Heimat, at home, we ran out of flour at least 1 or 2 days a week, and we all got to go home on full pay. And he said, well, that's not going to happen here. We're never going to run out of flour. And she said, I can't live like that. Okay, we'll go on with this on Thursday.